The night air hung heavy with an ominous sense of impending doom. Could a city so vibrant, so bustling with life, truly face complete annihilation by the morning? Lot and his family had long called the wicked city of Sodom home, but the time for departure had come. Could anyone living within its walls sense the judgment that was about to rain down upon them? Lot, a righteous man amidst great evil, had been warned by the angels to flee with his family. Could they abandon the life they had built so quickly, with destruction imminent? Time was running out. The angel's command was simple: flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away. Genesis 19, verse 17. Could such a clear and urgent command be difficult to follow, or was there more at play in the hearts of Lot's family? As the family packed what little they could carry, there was no time for sentimentality. Could anyone still feel attachment to a city so corrupt that God had decided to destroy it? Yet, as the urgency of the situation mounted, a deeper internal struggle began to rise. Could they resist looking back one final time at what they were leaving behind? Lot's wife, unnamed in the biblical text, faced a silent personal battle. Could she truly abandon everything she had ever known without one last glance? Her home, her friends, the life she had built, all of it was in the city about to be consumed by fire and brimstone. Could anyone leave behind their past without feeling a pang of sorrow or a desire to hold on to what once was? The angels had commanded strict obedience. Do not look back. But could she suppress the longing to see one last glimpse of the city that had once been her world? As they fled, the sounds of destruction began to rise behind them. Thunderous roars as sulfur and fire rained down from the sky. Could they truly escape the wrath of God, or was something even greater at stake in their journey to safety? Lot led his family, urging them onward, but his wife's steps slowed. Could the weight of leaving everything behind be more than she could bear? Each step away from Sodom was a step into the unknown, into a future she could not yet see. Could she resist the temptation to look back, to see for herself the destruction that was now unfolding behind her? The struggle of Lot's wife, between obedience and longing. Lot's wife's heart pounded as they fled. Could she suppress the yearning to turn back and see the city one final time? The angel's words echoed in her mind. Do not look back. Yet, the life she had known was being reduced to ash behind her. Could anyone walk away without a second glance at the place where they had once made a home? The tension in her heart grew with every step. Could obedience to God's command overcome the attachment she felt to her past? Her family urged her onward, but her thoughts were tethered to the life she was leaving behind. The command had been clear, but the heart is often a battlefield where the past fights with the present. Could Lot's wife, caught between the urgency of the moment and her longing for the familiar, truly obey? Every instinct told her to keep moving forward, but her soul ached for one last look. Could such a simple act of defiance really result in such severe consequences? The angels had not explained why looking back was forbidden, only that it was. Could a single glance back at her former life really be her undoing? The temptation grew stronger with each step. Could the need to look back, to see what was being lost, overwhelm the command to flee without hesitation? Her family was running ahead, but her feet slowed. Could Lot's wife have known what was at stake, or did she believe that just one look couldn't possibly result in punishment? She had already left the city, hadn't she? Could turning back for one moment really bring about the kind of doom the angels had warned of? The cries of Sodom's destruction filled the air. Could anyone truly resist the urge to witness it? Lot's wife wrestled with the tension between divine command and personal longing. Could she, like so many before her, succumb to the temptation of curiosity, even at the cost of disobedience? The city behind her had been her home. Could anyone truly move forward without some part of their heart yearning for what was being left behind? Her family pushed onward, but her pace faltered. Could Lot's wife have believed that her inner struggle was inconsequential in the grand scheme of things? Her desire to look back grew unbearable. Could disobedience seem so trivial in the heat of the moment, even when the consequences are eternal? The dust and smoke from the destruction clouded the sky behind her, and in that moment, she made her decision. Could she have known that this choice, so small in her eyes, would have such grave consequences? The longing to see Sodom one last time was too great. Could Lot's wife understand that obedience to God, even in the smallest things, can carry the weight of life or death? She turned. Could one glance really be her undoing, or was there something far greater at play? A test of faith, a test of loyalty. The moment of disobedience, Lot's wife looks back. In the midst of the chaos, Lot's wife stopped and turned. Could she have understood that this single act of defiance would seal her fate? The city of Sodom was engulfed in flames, the ground itself trembling under the weight of God's wrath. Could her longing for the past really outweigh the command to flee for her life? She turned her gaze to the city she had once called home, watching as it was consumed by fire and brimstone. Could she have known that the moment she looked back, her fate was no longer her own? The transformation was instant. Could a single glance really result in such a swift and final punishment? Her body, once flesh and blood, began to harden. Could Lot's wife have realized, even as she turned, that this was the consequence of disobedience? Her form stiffened, her skin crystallizing into salt. Could her act of defiance, so small and seemingly insignificant, have triggered such a powerful response from the divine? The life she had known was gone, and now her body was being consumed by the very elements that rained down upon the city she had longed to see one last time. Her heart, filled with longing for the past, was now as hard as the pillar of salt she had become. Could her desire to hold on to the past have caused her to lose her future? Her transformation was not just physical, it was a symbol of what happens when the heart refuses to move forward, clinging to what God has already declared lost. Could Lot's wife, now frozen in time, serve as a warning to all who struggle with the temptation to look back, even when God commands them to move forward? Her fate was sealed, her disobedience a reminder of the cost of turning away from God's commands. Lot and his daughters continued to flee, unaware of what had happened. Could they, in their haste to escape, have realized that one of their own had fallen victim to the very punishment they were trying to avoid? When Lot finally turned to look for his wife, it was too late. Could he, standing there in the shadow of God's judgment, have believed that his wife had been spared until he saw the statue of salt where she had once stood? The realization hit him like a weight. She had disobeyed, and now she was gone. Could Lot have ever imagined that such a fate would befall the woman he had loved? The pillar of salt stood as a silent witness to the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. Could anyone who passed by, seeing the statue where Lot's wife had once been, fail to understand the gravity of her disobedience? Her story, though brief, carried with it a powerful message. God's commands are not to be taken lightly. Could Lot's wife, frozen in time, have served as a lasting reminder to all who struggle with the temptation to look back at what God has called them to leave behind? Her transformation was complete. She had become a monument to what happens when the past holds too tight a grip on the heart. The land around her was scorched, the cities reduced to ash, but Lot's wife remained, immobile, a pillar of salt standing against the backdrop of God's wrath. Could her fate have been avoided if she had only kept her eyes forward? The angels had given clear instructions: flee, don't look back. But Lot's wife, caught between the life she had known and the unknown future ahead, couldn't resist. Could her struggle reflect the same inner battles we all face when God calls us to leave behind what is familiar in favor of what is unknown? The consequences of disobedience, a lesson for all. Lot, his heart heavy with grief, turned his eyes away from the pillar of salt that had once been his wife. Could the weight of disobedience be felt so profoundly, even in such a seemingly small act? The price she had paid was eternal, frozen in time, unable to move forward with her family. Could Lot have known that obedience to God's commands would be the line between life and death? The city of Sodom was no more, and now, neither was she. Could this moment serve as a reminder to all who struggle with leaving behind the past when God calls them to move forward? The transformation of Lot's wife was not just a punishment, it was a symbol. Could anyone who saw her pillar of salt, standing as a monument of disobedience, ignore the lesson embedded within it? Lot's wife had been given the chance to flee, to start anew, but her heart had been bound to the life she had left behind. Could her fate have been different if she had only trusted in God's plan for her future? Her choice was a warning, a message that looking back, even for a moment, can prevent us from stepping into the promises God has for us. Could her story be a mirror for those who struggle with leaving behind their own pasts? Lot's daughters, shaken but obedient, continued forward without looking back. Could they, even in their fear and uncertainty, understand the gravity of the moment? Their mother's disobedience had sealed her fate, but they had chosen to trust in the angel's command. Could their choice to keep their eyes forward serve as an example of what it means to follow God's call, even when it requires leaving everything behind? The weight of their loss was heavy, but the promise of survival was greater. Could their faithfulness, in contrast to their mother's defiance, be the key to their future? As they reached the mountains, the full impact of Sodom's destruction unfolded behind them. Could Lot's family, standing on the threshold of a new beginning, fully comprehend the magnitude of what had happened? The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were gone, reduced to ash and ruin, and Lot's wife was now a part of the landscape, a symbol of what happens when the heart clings to the past. Could her story, though tragic, serve as a warning to all who would follow? Her pillar of salt stood as a silent testament to the cost of disobedience. Could anyone who heard her story ever forget the weight of her choice? Her story would echo through the generations, a tale of disobedience, longing, and the consequences of looking back. Could Lot's wife, in her final moment, have understood the significance of her choice? Or was she blinded by her attachment to what was lost? Her pillar of salt, standing alone in the desolate plains, became more than just a symbol. It became a lesson for all who would hear it. Could her story serve as a reminder that when God calls us to move forward, there is no life to be found in looking back? Her fate was sealed, but the lesson was timeless. The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was swift, but the story of Lot's wife would endure. Could her pillar of salt stand as a reminder to all who would struggle with obedience to God's call? Lot's wife had been given a chance to escape, to start anew, but her heart had been bound to the city she had left behind. Could her story, though tragic, inspire others to trust in God's plan, even when it requires letting go of the past? Her pillar of salt was more than a punishment. It was a symbol of the choice we all face when God calls us to move forward. The lesson of Lot's wife, a warning to future generations. Lot's wife, now a pillar of salt, became more than just a tragic figure. She became a warning for generations to come. Could her story, passed down through the centuries, serve as a reminder of the dangers of disobedience and looking back? Her choice to glance at the past, at the life she had left behind, sealed her fate. Could future generations learn from her mistake and resist the temptation to hold on to what God had called them to leave behind? Her pillar of salt stood as a monument to the consequences of ignoring divine commands. Could anyone who heard her story remain unchanged by the gravity of her fate? The story of Lot's wife spread quickly throughout the region. Could those who had heard of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah understand that her transformation was not just a punishment, but a symbol of what happens when the heart refuses to let go of the past? Lot's wife had been given the opportunity to flee, to survive, and to start a new life, but her attachment to what was lost had cost her everything. Could anyone who heard her story still doubt the importance of trusting in God's commands, even when they required difficult sacrifices? The pillar of salt became a reminder to all who passed by that obedience to God is a matter of life and death. Lot's daughters, though shaken by the loss of their mother, pressed forward, understanding the gravity of their situation. Could they, in their grief, comprehend that their mother's fate was a lesson for them as well? Their survival depended on their willingness to follow God's commands without hesitation or doubt. Could their faithfulness, in contrast to their mother's disobedience, be the key to their future? The choices they made now, as they fled to the mountains, would determine the course of their lives. Could they, like so many before them, resist the urge to look back and instead trust fully in God's plan for their future? The angels who had rescued Lot's family had given strict instructions: flee and don't look back. Could the simplicity of the command be what made it so difficult to follow? Lot's wife had believed that just one glance couldn't possibly hurt, but that glance had cost her everything. Could her story be a reminder that even the smallest acts of disobedience can have profound consequences? Her pillar of salt stood as a testament to the importance of obedience, no matter how difficult or counterintuitive the command may seem. Could anyone who heard her story still believe that they could disobey God's commands without consequence? For Lot, the loss of his wife was a painful reminder of the cost of disobedience. Could he, as a man who had tried so hard to protect his family, have ever imagined that one of them would fall victim to such a fate? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah had been swift and final, but his wife's transformation had been the result of a choice, her choice to defy the command given to them. Could Lot's grief be compounded by the knowledge that her death was avoidable, had she only followed the angel's instructions? His heart was heavy, but he knew that they had no choice but to move forward. Lot's wife had been a part of his life for so long, and now she was gone, frozen in time as a pillar of salt. Could Lot, as he continued his journey, reflect on the importance of obedience, knowing that his wife's fate was a warning to him and his daughters? The city they had left behind was nothing more than ash, but the weight of its destruction would remain with them forever. Could the loss of his wife serve as a constant reminder that obedience to God is not optional, but essential? Lot's journey was not just physical, it was spiritual. Could the lessons he learned from his wife's disobedience guide him as he moved forward? The pillar of salt, standing alone in the desolate plain, became a symbol for all who heard her story. Could anyone who passed by fail to grasp the significance of what had happened to Lot's wife? Her disobedience was not just a moment of weakness. It was a choice that had eternal consequences. Could her story serve as a reminder to all who hear it that God's commands, no matter how difficult, are always for our protection and our good? Lot's wife had looked back, and in doing so, she had lost her future. Could anyone who hears her story ever forget the cost of looking back? The pillar of salt, a monument to the past. The pillar of salt stood as a haunting reminder of what happens when the past holds too strong a grip on the heart. Could Lot's wife, frozen in place, serve as a cautionary tale for all who struggle with leaving behind what God has declared finished? Her story became a monument to disobedience, a visual representation of the consequences of turning back when God has commanded us to move forward. Could anyone who saw her statue continue to believe that the past is worth clinging to, even when God calls us to something new? The pillar of salt, though silent, spoke volumes about the cost of holding on to what God had already judged. The people of Israel, as they traveled through the region, would pass by the pillar and remember her story. Could Lot's wife, in her final moments, have understood that her disobedience would become a lasting lesson for generations to come? Her story was not just a tragic end for one woman. It was a symbol of what happens when we refuse to trust in God's plan. Could the people of Israel, hearing her story, learn to trust in God's commands even when they don't fully understand them? The pillar stood as a reminder that God's wisdom is far greater than our own. Could future generations learn from her mistake and choose obedience over attachment to the past? The pillar of salt became a symbol for the nation of Israel, a warning against idolatry, disobedience, and the dangers of looking back. Could Lot's wife, who had once lived among the wicked people of Sodom, now serve as a reminder of the importance of living in obedience to God? The Israelites, hearing her story, would see the pillar as a testament to the consequences of failing to trust in God's commands. Could her story, though brief, have a profound impact on the spiritual lives of the people of Israel, reminding them to always move forward in faith? The pillar of salt, standing alone in the wilderness, was a constant reminder of the dangers of looking back. For Lot, the journey continued, but the memory of his wife's fate lingered. Could he, even in his grief, understand that her story was a part of a much larger narrative, one that would shape the faith of future generations? Lot had obeyed, but his wife had not. Could her story serve as a lesson to his daughters and to all who would hear it about the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when it means leaving behind what is familiar? Lot's heart was heavy, but he knew that the journey forward was the only option. Could his story, intertwined with his wife's, become a beacon of hope and faith for future generations? The destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was complete, but the pillar of salt stood as a reminder that God's judgment is swift and final. Could the people of Israel, hearing the story of Lot's wife, understand that obedience to God is not just about avoiding punishment, but about trusting in his plan for their lives? Lot's wife had looked back, but the people of Israel were called to look forward, to the promises of God, to the future he had in store for them. Could her story serve as a reminder that when God calls us to leave something behind, it's because he has something better ahead? As the years passed, the pillar of salt became a part of the landscape, a permanent reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Could anyone who passed by fail to see the significance of what had happened to Lot's wife? Her story became a symbol of what happens when the heart clings to the past instead of trusting in God's plan for the future. Could the pillar, though weathered by time, continue to speak to future generations about the importance of obedience and faith? Lot's wife, though gone, left behind a legacy that would shape the spiritual lives of countless people. Could anyone who heard her story fail to understand the gravity of her choice? The legacy of Lot's wife, a warning for all, the atonement. Lot's wife's story would be passed down from generation to generation, a cautionary tale about the dangers of disobedience. Could her fate, though tragic, serve as a reminder to all who struggle with letting go of the past? Her story was not just about one woman, it was about the universal struggle to trust in God's plan, even when it requires leaving behind what is familiar. Could her pillar of salt stand as a monument to the consequences of disobedience, a reminder that God's commands are always for our good, even when they are difficult to follow? For the people of Israel, the story of Lot's wife became a symbol of the importance of faithfulness. Could they, hearing her story, understand that God's commands are not arbitrary, but are meant to guide us toward life and away from destruction? Lot's wife had been given the opportunity to escape, but her heart had been bound to the city she had left behind. Could her story serve as a warning to all who would cling to the past instead of trusting in God's plan for the future? Her pillar of salt became a lasting reminder that disobedience, even in the smallest things, can have eternal consequences. Lot's wife, though silenced by her fate, continued to speak through her story. Could anyone who heard her story fail to grasp the importance of trusting in God's plan, even when it means leaving behind what we hold dear? Her disobedience had cost her everything, but her story became a lesson for all who would follow. Could her fate serve as a reminder that obedience to God's commands is not just about avoiding punishment, but about embracing the life that God has planned for us? The pillar of salt stood as a testament to the cost of looking back when God calls us to move forward. The story of Lot's wife became a part of Israel's history, a lesson that would be taught to future generations. Could her story serve as a reminder that faithfulness to God's commands is the key to life, while disobedience leads to destruction? Her pillar of salt, standing alone in the wilderness, was a monument to the consequences of defying God's instructions. Could her story, though tragic, inspire future generations to trust in God's plan, even when it requires letting go of the past? Lot's wife had looked back, but her story continued to move forward, shaping the faith of all who heard it. For Lot and his daughters, the journey continued, but the memory of what had happened to Lot's wife lingered. Could they, even in their grief, understand that her story was not just about her, but about the importance of trusting in God's plan for the future? Lot's wife had been given the chance to escape, but her heart had been bound to the life she had left behind. Could her story serve as a warning to all who would struggle with leaving behind what God has called them to let go of? The journey forward was difficult, but it was the only way to embrace the future that God had in store for them. The pillar of salt became a part of Israel's collective memory, a story that would be told for generations to come. Could anyone who heard the story of Lot's wife fail to understand the importance of obedience to God's commands? Her fate, though tragic, became a lesson for all who would follow, a reminder that God's plan is always for our good, even when it requires difficult sacrifices. Could her story, though brief, continue to speak to future generations about the importance of trusting in God's plan for the future? The pillar of salt, standing alone in the wilderness, was a symbol of the cost of looking back, the eternal lesson of Lot's wife. Lot's wife's story is a powerful reminder that when God calls us to move forward, looking back can cost us everything. Could her story, though tragic, inspire future generations to trust in God's plan, even when it means leaving behind what is familiar? Her disobedience had eternal consequences, but her story serves as a lasting lesson for all who hear it. Could the pillar of salt stand as a reminder that obedience to God is the path to life, while clinging to the past leads to destruction? Lot's wife had looked back, but her story moved forward, shaping the faith of all who heard it. The pillar of salt, standing alone in the wilderness, became a monument to the importance of trusting in God's commands. Could anyone who passed by fail to grasp the significance of what had happened to Lot's wife? Her story became a symbol of the universal struggle to trust in God's plan, even when it requires leaving behind what is familiar. Could her story inspire future generations to trust in God's plan, even when it requires letting go of the past? The pillar of salt was a lasting reminder that God's commands are not to be taken lightly. For Lot, the loss of his wife was a painful reminder of the cost of disobedience. Could he, even in his grief, understand that her story was a part of a much larger narrative, one that would shape the faith of future generations? Her pillar of salt became a symbol of what happens when we refuse to trust in God's plan. Could her story serve as a reminder to all who hear it that obedience to God's commands is not just about avoiding punishment, but about embracing the life that God has planned for us? The journey forward was difficult, but it was the only way to embrace the future that God had in store. The story of Lot's wife continues to resonate today, serving as a powerful reminder of the importance of faithfulness to God's commands. Could her story inspire us to trust in God's plan, even when it requires leaving behind what we hold dear? Her pillar of salt, standing alone in the wilderness, speaks to the consequences of looking back when God calls us to move forward. Could her story, though tragic, inspire us to embrace the future that God has planned for us? trusting that his ways are always for our good. Lot's wife had looked back, but her story moves us forward. The story of Lot's wife serves as a powerful reminder of the consequences of disobedience. What about you? Have you ever found yourself holding on to the past when God was calling you to move forward? Could Lot's wife's story inspire you to trust in God's plan, even when it requires letting go of what is familiar? Her life became a monument to the cost of looking back, but her story also serves as a lesson for us to follow God's commands faithfully. If this story resonated with you, don't stop here. Subscribe to our channel for more biblical narratives that challenge and inspire your faith. Share your thoughts. How has Lot's wife's story impacted your understanding of obedience and faith? Let us know in the comments below, and let's discuss how we can apply these lessons to our own lives. How will you choose to trust in God's plan for your future today? Comment below.